I'm more than a rare exception, you can't compare him. I'm fly as Tuskegee Airman. My patience is as thin as her pins. You find a sucker cat that's talking smack and I'll just dare him. Come at me sideways attacking, I'm pushing back.
CM Punk's virtue signaling always manages to pay off. Now we got certified lunatic leftist Dave Zirin, who is a sports reporter, writing entire articles where he literally doesn't really understand pro wrestling. Doesn't go too deeply into it, but he wants to show his support for the Democrats and his anti-Linda McMahon rhetoric and his love for CM Punk. But does he really care about the students in this situation? Which is always the conversation when you talk about teachers and teachers unions. What is the purpose of these things? Are they jobs programs, or is it to actually educate children? So let's get into this. On Instagram, there is a response by Edge of Sports, which is the brand owned by Dave Zirin. And he is talking about CM Punk showing up with a Chicago Teachers Union shirt on Raw, which I addressed in my Raw review. So Dave Zirin says, we'll have a piece up tomorrow trashing WWE and their longtime CEO, Linda McMahon, for their history of bigotry and why that makes her a perfect choice as Trump's education secretary. But tonight, we have CM Punk coming out to the ring on Raw with a Chicago Teachers Union shirt, given Linda's new gig, dismantling the Department of Education, given the anti-union history of this company, given the attacks on our most vulnerable students, given their demonization of our heroic teachers, given the CTU's recent history of victorious strikes. I gotta tip my hat here. The CM stands for Chicago Made, and he always reps it to the fullest. La lucha continua. The fight continues. So, this article was written in The Nation. Linda McMahon's only qualification as education secretary is a history of spreading hate. And even in Trump's cabinet of hucksters, reality show stars, and drunk white nationalists, Linda McMahon is a bizarre choice for education secretary, written by Dave Zirin. So this is going to be fun, at least for me. I don't know about for you, but for me, it's going to be fun. Boy, it's not often that a mainstream sports writer is involved in WWE, but it is exactly what you would think it is, in terms of the amount of rhetoric in this thing. Now, I'm not going to go through the full article. It was very long, and it was mostly politics. Again, Dave Zirin is a sports reporter, but as usual, he goes mostly through politics. So here's what he's talking about: the first blacks. Talk about the first Masters and golf and all this kind of stuff. He says the first black man's win of the WWF Championship was in 1997 when the biracial charisma machine Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson took the belt. It would not happen again for another black wrestler until 2019 when the title adorned the waist of Kofi Kingston. The longtime fan favorite was then squashed in 8 seconds by German-American Ubermensch Brock Lesnar and never got a rematch. This backstage decision was widely perceived as humiliating to Kingston and a slap in the face to fans and black wrestlers who were literally crying with joy when Kofi was crowned. Okay, so this is an accurate depiction of what happened. Unfortunately, Linda McMahon was not working for the company when this occurred. She didn't work there when this happened. She wasn't even there. Dave, she wasn't working there. Linda has not been involved with WWE in years, literally over a decade. In fact, Linda McMahon was gone for 10 years before this Kofi Kingston thing even happened. She retired or resigned as CEO in 2009. 2009. Why are you not mentioning that? Did you not look into this? You didn't look into this, did you? So she got nothing to do with what happened with Kofi Kingston. It has nothing to do with that. And then also, got to ask the question, why don't Booker T and Mark Henry count? Why don't they count? Oh, it was a secondary heavyweight championship. Managed to count when we talking about Triple H. Managed to count when we talk about Rey Mysterio. But it don't matter. It don't count when we talking about world champions. Never mind. Let's keep moving. Dave Zirin continues. In the world of sports entertainment, where outcomes are scripted, the most common role for black wrestlers has been minstrelsy, Ugandan headhunters, voodoo practitioners holding human skulls, and a black woman named Sapphire. And then in brackets, he writes, the Sapphire caricature is a minstrel trope from the 20th century, so none of this was subtle. Now, what is the Sapphire caricature? Because I have no idea what this is. And so I went and looked it up. He was, had hyperlinked it. So this is what he posted. So Sapphire, for those of you who are too young, was the manager of Dusty Rhodes in the WWF. She wore the polka dot, she danced with Dusty and all this kind of stuff. She was kind of like a mascot to tell everybody what Dusty represents, which is the American dream, right? Blacks and whites dancing together, having fun, all that stuff, right? This is what the Sapphire caricature is, according to the Jim Crow Museum. The Sapphire caricature portrays black women as rude, loud, malicious, stubborn, and overbearing. That's not Sapphire at all. Sweet Sapphire was none of that. She was not loud and rude, and she was a babyface. And everybody was supposed to like her, not dislike her. So they continue by saying Sapphire is tart-tongued and emasculating. One hand on a hip, the other pointing and jabbing, or arms akimbo, violently and rhythmically rocking her head, mocking American men for offenses ranging from being unemployed to sexually pursuing white women. Again, this has nothing to do with Sapphire. This guy has nothing. Just because the name is used does not mean that was the character. All right? Sweet Sapphire was not a Sapphire trope or whatever the fuck. And I didn't even know that existed. Right? I thought it was more of a modern creation, but it's nice to know that that was going on in the 1920s or in the 1910s or whatever. So another swing and miss by Dave Zirin, sports reporter. He continues by saying, much ink has been spilled about the WWE's history of racism, sexism, homophobia, and ableism. Oh my God. Amazing. Ableism. Huh. They're just guilty of all the isms. In these analyses, the blame for their constant commodified mockery of marginalized groups has been put upon the shoulders of the boss, the alleged sex trafficker, rapist, and friend of Donald Trump, Vince McMahon. In brackets, he writes, the racism at WWE also never just in front of the cameras. According to a recent lawsuit, it flourished behind the scenes as well. The woman who stole a chair, right? Again, that was... This woman stole a chair and then sued because she got fired for stealing a chair. Oh, well, everybody gets to take chairs. Really? Is that really what happened? Or is it that you stole chairs? You stole chairs, woman. Get bent. But then again, you wouldn't know that because these people, they don't actually read these things. They don't go through them. They don't know that much about them. It's just stacking talking points. There's not much substance here. So, of course, he has to talk about Vince. Even though this article is supposed to be about Linda, because she's the one who's going to be education secretary. But whatever. Vince McMahon conveniently obscures the role of the company's former longtime CEO who operated largely, if not always, off camera, Linda McMahon. Every bit of racist bile spewed by this company has her stamp of approval. She also held the alleged job of covering up the numerous allegations of gender violence levied against her husband. And then in brackets, federal prosecutors quietly dropped the charges against Vince on February the 14th, which I'm sure was done in the interest of justice and had nothing to do with Trump's seizure of the Justice Department. Actually, it was dropped in early January. If you actually read Dave, it was actually dropped in early January. But they had 3 years to come up with evidence, and the only thing they could come up with was Vince didn't disclose that he was spending money on his hoes. That was it. He was spending money to protect the reputation of the business on these hoes, but again, had nothing to do with Linda. She wasn't even there. She wasn't there. But she was there for this. Linda McMahon is, of course, Trump's nominee for Education Secretary in the United States. Even in this cabinet of hucksters, reality show stars, and drunk white nationalists, it's a bizarre choice. Not only does she know nearly nothing about basic education policy, as seen in her confirmation hearing, she has been sued for covering up the sexual abuse of a child at WWE. I know it's cliche, but imagine the QAnon riot if a Democratic nominee for education secretary, of all jobs, was stained with such a charge. This is legitimate because it does affect Linda. It was a situation that has been known for a really long time. But it's questionable whether they were covering it up. Considering the argument is, what did they know at the time versus what did they learn later, right? And being suspicious is not being sure. So understand that what people are talking about at the time. So, and also, I don't want to get into the wormhole of Linda McMahon and Tom Cole, because that's a very, very winding road. All right. Tom Cole being the most famous of all the ring boys who accused Mel Phillips of impropriety. But also, let's say if Linda is guilty, then why isn't the FBI guilty? And they supposedly had a tape. Well, then at that point, you have to realize what the FBI says on the tape is not sexual abuse of children. So, again, what people know versus what they can prove, or what the people think versus what they can prove. It's two different things. But she is accused of this, and that's at least relevant. So he continues by saying the first sign in her lack of expertise in education, he's claiming, in her largely overlooked confirmation hearings, when she was asked about whether she supported teaching Black history in schools, and she answered, "I'm not quite certain. I reached out to educator and author of the recent book, Teach Truth, The Struggle for Anti-Racist Education, Jesse Hagopian, about McMahon's comments. Hagopian said, entertaining the possibility of outlawing Black history in the U.S. is about rigging the fight so justice always loses. The goal of these attacks on education is to create fear and confusion so that teachers hesitate to tell the truth about systemic racism." When you found the most far left idiot you can find to ask them about this thing. But let's talk about this real quick. All right. Because this did not give justice to any of the situations that it is supposedly discussing here. Now, I found a site that is still kind of far left. All right. But it actually more fleshes out the exchange that occurred between Linda and this senator. So it says, this is from New America. McMahon told the panel that she is, quote, in favor of our history exactly as it happened. That's a quote from her. But when pressed on what that meant in practice, she deflected. Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut questioned the scope of the Trump administration's executive order on DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, which eliminates, quote, grants to organizations and entities that support DEI programs. All right. The senator says, this has schools across the country scrambling because they have no idea what it means. What does a school know whether it's running a DEI program or not? Well, Senator, considering you guys came up with the term DEI, you guys labeled it DEI, you guys built DEI departments, these universities and these schools which built DEI departments, they know what DEI is. The idea that they have no idea what DEI is, that's a lie. It's bullshit, all right? They know exactly what it is. So here's the reported answer. McMahon searched for an answer. DEI programs were having the opposite of their intended effect, she argued. This is supposed to be a direct quote from her. We are getting back to more segregating of our schools instead of having a more inclusion in our schools. And when she was pressed for example, she says, McMahon pointed to graduation programs held to honor Black and Hispanic students. And she said, we are not doing what we wanted to achieve with inclusion. Now, understand, the confusion here is always in how words are used. Yes, there is some obfuscation about what DEI actually is, even though it's just souped up affirmative action, essentially. And it's a twisting in history. I'm going to go into a little bit more in a minute. But understand, you use words to be straightforward. They use words to obfuscate. What you mean by inclusion, that's not what they mean. So when she's talking about blacks and Hispanics having segregated graduation programs or graduation ceremonies, that is not inclusive. But that's her definition of inclusive, which is a normal definition of inclusive. The leftist definition of inclusive is whatever we decide is right. And it's inclusive to have no all white graduation program, but you get to have an all black or all Hispanic program. And they do this all the time. They have all these programs where are specifically for women, but then they complain about gender problems. Then they say all these things are just for blacks, and then they complain that, when black people don't get something, it's racism. And they do this all the time. It's inclusion for you, not for me. These words are not used to mean in any way normal, to convey to normal people what you're trying to do. It is not. All right? Understand that. Murphy, unconvinced by McMahon's answer, pressed further. He asked bluntly how the ban would implicate funding schools while teaching African American history. This is exactly what Dave Zirin is talking about. He says, what about educational programming centered around specific ethnic and racial identities? You're saying that there's a possibility that public schools that run African American history classes could lose federal funding if they continue to teach African American history, right? Linda responded, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I'd like to take a look at these programs and fully understand the breadth of the executive order and get back to you, right? That's what she said. The issue here is what the fuck he means by African American history. Because African American history is 1619 project to him. Again, these people are not using words to be straightforward. Nobody is saying you can't teach about Martin Luther King or Medgar Evers or Frederick Douglass, who they never teach about anyway. They don't talk about that. They're talking about 1619 project, King Cotton, sort of ridiculous historical stuff. The things that they think is the most important elements of history, right? And she's saying, I want to see if these are sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs that have the opposite effect of creating diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? If you're in these schools, which they are, teaching white guilt, then yes, those programs are going to be losing funding. If you're going to tell the truth, then no. And the truth is actually African American history. For instance, the idea that all white people held slaves, or that people, the first start of the 1619 project is a lie. The people who came here during 1619 were Christians. Christians cannot hold other Christians enslaved according to English law, and those people were English. So that the blacks that came with the English in 1619 were indentured servants, quote unquote. Now, you will say, what's the difference? When the Irish came over here, they were indentured servants. And a lot of the British who came over here afterwards, too, were indentured servants. If you were to talk to all these DEI professors and say, well, if the people who came here in 1619 were slaves, then all the white people who were also indentured servants who came over here, well, those had to be slaves too. And they'll say, no. Those were indentured servants. They were not slaves. Okay, so then neither were the people who came here in 1619. But that's not how they use words. They use words to say, we have chosen a victim oppressed class. What we say about this victim oppressed class is true, but it is not equal to any other class. So when you mention like the Ku Klux Klan, however, they don't mention that one of the largest hangings of the Ku Klux Klan happened to Italians. That's not, nope, can't talk about that. The discrimination against Italians and the Irish. Can't talk about that. Discrimination against the Chinese. You may hear some about that because they need the Chinese and Asians. They need to rope them into their guilt problems. But the Irish and the Italians being victimized by, Protestant white society? No, they don't want to talk about that. For what? That might mean that people are against outsiders of all kinds, not just blacks or Indians, but any kind of outsider. And that includes outsiders that supposedly, quote unquote, look like them, which would be white-skinned people, right? So when you talk about teaching African-American history, what are you talking about, right? What subjects specifically? What subject? And how are you approaching that subject? Because what we see is these historians are twisting things, taking something that is true and then turning it into something that's mostly fiction. The Tulsa Race Massacre, which is now being labeled a race massacre, when for decades, especially when I was a kid, it was called a race riot, right? But now it's a race massacre. You look at all the historical evidence of what happened there, and you don't get race riot or race massacre. It wasn't like a bunch of white people marched down from a mountaintop and just started to killing black people. That's not really what happened. But that's not what they would teach. They would teach that the barbarians were at the gate and that there was so much hatred about black people in Tulsa that they killed them. They started killing them, even though that's not what happened. The Fire Nation did not attack Tulsa. Almost all of these race riots and things like this were triggered by small events between racial groups. Either a woman accusing a man of touching her, trying to rape her or something like that, which is usually exaggerated, the Emmett Till thing. There's also, I believe, Rosewood, and it was that in Florida. There's quite a few of those kind of incidents, and Tulsa was similar, all right? The idea was that these groups had a lot of tension between them, and they got into a fight, and things got out of control. But progressives are working under the understanding that everything is within this framework of systemic racism. That means every single thing is racist. Every single person is racist. There is no escaping it. So that you don't learn about abolitionists and how abolition was a white Christian movement. That's fact. It's been documented even by black historians that the first anti-slavery protesters in the entirety of the United States, hell, anywhere in the world, were white Christians. But they don't have that conversation with you. You don't learn that. And that's why on Twitter I recently tweeted out, I'm going to stop reading history books written within the last 30 years. Nobody should be reading these books. They're trash. Okay? You learn so much more by going back to history books written in the 70s and the 60s or whatever, because they were a little bit more honest. Now the entire education establishment, from professors to teachers to people who write books, they're all just crazy, lunatic communists for the most part. And I don't say that lightly. They have a entrenched ideology that will not allow them to tell the truth. They simply cannot tell the truth. Like, one of the many things that they talk about is African Americans built this country because slavery, or cotton, which is the number one plant that was grown in the South, built this country. It's like, no. Every piece of historical information that we can find prior to all these people writing these stupid ass articles indicates that the South was less economically advanced than the North, where there was no slavery, where there was free blacks, where black people voted and had guns. Every time you hear people discuss history, it's almost anti-South history, right? They're talking about Southern plantation owners, and then even when they're talking about that, they're talking about the very, very minutia of Southern plantation owners, the ones who owned multiple slaves. Most white people couldn't even own one slave. Most white people didn't even own slaves. But again, you're not allowed to have that conversation. Telling the truth would say, man, only a fraction of white people even had slaves, and even a fraction of that fraction had multiple slaves. So these gigantic slave plantations, like in Django Unchained or something like that, those were incredibly rare. But those guys did have an outsized amount of influence because they were aristocratic. They had time to build social networks because they were not working, right? So they had time to sit around and gossip, and this was their lifestyle. You could read books like by Eugene Genovese that talks about the aristocratic nature of the South, that they didn't care about being behind the North in terms of advancement and infrastructure and all that. They didn't care because they had their own insular society where the slave owners, the people who ran these large plantations, had a lot of political power because they had time to politic all day. Meanwhile, people who actually worked, the people who really built the country, the folks who engaged in manufacturing, which were typically in the North, those people were far more advanced and had far a bigger hand in building the country than the people in the South did. And then you also have to understand, too, the South was destroyed during the Civil War. It was occupied similar to how the United States military destroyed and occupied Afghanistan or Iraq. All right? They completely destroyed, they burned a lot of these plantations to the ground. And that's why they had to give plantation owners money, because they destroyed their property. Not just they took their slaves, they also burned their house and they burned their crops. All right? This is real history. This is not that systemic racism bullshit. And you can feel however you want to feel about it. But the reason it happened is because they wanted to destroy the South, because they wanted to expand into the South. It was economic. Then there was a lot more. And another thing they could talk about, these DEI programs. They talk about why the Civil War happened. The Civil War happened because of slavery. States' rights are not a real thing. States' rights was an issue going way back to the 1800s, all right, before the Civil War. They'll have you believe that the states' rights issue was created by the South to go into about slavery. Incorrect. States' rights actually began in like Massachusetts when they opposed the fugitive slave law. There were states in the North that refused to enact the fugitive slave law, which means they refused to let Negroes who were in their state be taken and removed from that state and taken back to plantations in the South. The Supreme Court of the United States says it's the law. We passed this law nationally. It is imposed upon the states. That's actually the beginning of the states' rights issue, as states like Pennsylvania and Massachusetts were finding ways to resist the fugitive slave law, which meant they created black militias, letting black people own guns, even though the United States government says that black people could not own guns. They could not be part of the militia, right? They banned them from state militias. But then the states would still say, okay, you can have your own black militia to resist slave owners who are going to be coming up here or sending people up here, bounty hunters or whatever, to retrieve Negro slaves. Now, when you have this conversation, this entire conversation, you understand history. States' rights was indeed about slavery, but it was about states wanting to make their own decisions. Some states did not want to deal with the fugitive slave law. They didn't want their citizens being kidnapped in the middle of the night. The South wanted to have slaves, and they did not want the North telling them they could not have slaves. Both sides are arguing about their way of life, right? But you're not having that conversation. Also, there was things like tariffs. That was an issue in the South. Expansion of manufacturing and infrastructure. How much land in the South that was tied up in these plantations, these large plantations. And that was another reason why the South was so economically retarded, was because they tied up so much land in agriculture. When in the North, it wasn't that much land tied up in agriculture. These large plantations were able to limit manufacturing and different things like this. There's so much history that if you actually told history fairly, you would not get a black people good, white people bad mentality. Because for starters, a lot of this is white people versus white people, with Negroes sprinkled in here and there. All right, like the anti-slavery movement is a white Christian movement that Negroes took over, as things went on. But it took for a lot of white people to get the ball rolling before the blacks started joining in. And this is true. It's just true. But does this meet the historical narrative? No. They're not talking about history this way. They don't talk about states' rights this way. They don't talk about, the states versus the federal government, the federalism of the United States. They don't talk about it this way. It's white people bad, black people good. Slavery is the only thing that the South was interested in, when that's not true. But you would actually have to read real history books to know this stuff. And they don't. They don't read real history books because these things are progressive ideology. That's what it is. This is why when you see people talk so much about Martin Luther King and Marxism, or Martin Luther King being a communist and all this kind of stuff, it's so shocking. And it takes people like, what do you mean when you say Martin Luther King wasn't a real Christian? It's like, well, there's people who really read these things and recognize the stuff for what it is. It's not a value judgment. It's factual information. I thought we were teaching facts here, but it's not. What they're teaching is narratives. It's a completely different thing. Narratives that's another word for story. You're telling stories, because teaching people facts and dates and stuff like this, they don't retain it. If you teach them a story, then they retain the story. And that's what they want to teach. They want to turn history into a story where everything's nebulous. And in stories, a lot of time, who's the good guys and who the bad guys are very clear. The fact that the good guys might not be doing good things for good reasons, like, oh, the North, they love Negroes and there were free states. Like, yeah, but they also had segregation in the North. As a matter of fact, a lot of those anti-slavery abolitionist movements, they were still segregationists. They still didn't think black people were the equals of whites. That's history. They fought to end slavery because they said it was an affront to God. They didn't mean they wanted black people in their churches. They still didn't want that. They still didn't believe in interracial marriage. This was the 1850s. They didn't want no Negro in-laws. No way. But that's teaching history. That's appropriate history. This is not trying to make people supervillains. So when Linda McMahon says, I want to take a look at these programs and then I'll get back to you, means let's take a look at what the approach to history is here. Is it through an ideological lens where everybody white is bad, everybody black is good, these things did not occur in the way that you're claiming that they occurred, all this stuff is just a story, it's narrative, it's not history? Those are things that are worth discussing. So let's get back to Dave Zirin. He says that would mean schools could lose federal funding for teaching AP history, African American history, which it says my son's favorite class, or having a club for Latinx students, which do not exist. There's no such thing as a Latinx. Or painting an elementary school mural of Rosa Parks during Black History Month. None of these things have ever been banned, by the way. But as Hagopian describes, the real goal of McMahon's memo is to sow fear in teachers and administrators about what they can and cannot teach. He calls Linda McMahon an educational arsonist, burning down our rich history of resistance to make us ignorant of the idea that change is possible and hamper our ability to fight back. What is he talking about? Again, they're just using words. Their history of resistance. Resistance to what? Hamper our ability to fight back. Fight back from what? What are you talking about? Right? Who are you fighting, white man? Dave Zirin is white. Now, I think he might be Jewish. Yeah, don't get me up. He might be Jewish. But Dave Zirin is white. What are you resisting, Dave? You're a part of the system of white supremacy, Dave. Or I'm sorry, it's not you, right? You're a good boy. You and Tim Wise and all this fake shit you guys go through. You're a good boy. You're one of the good ones. Get lost. You're probably the most racist dude in the world. So then he starts talking about CM Punk. He says, on Monday night, star wrestler Phil Brooks, known as CM Punk, walked to the ring wearing a Chicago Teachers Union shirt. This was not scripted. Brooks, an institution unto himself in his hometown of Chicago, has known people connected to the CTU for years. To come out in this shirt on this day, his boss declared war on public education. She doesn't work there. A boss whose family's union busting as part of WWE history was an act of public defiance. Brooks also has publicly supported transgender youth, one target of McMahon's attacks on our most vulnerable students. Again, Dave Zirin doesn't know shit about wrestling. All right? He doesn't know anything. Linda McMahon has not worked in WWE since 2009. She has not been CM Punk's boss since 2009. They have no connection to each other now. He can wear whatever fucking shirt he wants to wear. He can be as wrong as he wants, and we don't, again, talk about how wrong he is. He continues by Phil Brooks is not Joe Hill, as liberal skulls on social media were quick to point out. But in this era, we should embrace imperfect messengers, willing to stand up to this fascistic agenda. While many liberals roll their eyes given the backdrop of WWE, the public school teachers in my life were delighted by that photo. They felt seen, and given the popularity of WWE among their students, they were especially thrilled with who was watching. This is hilarious. Now, this is pretty much the end of what I'm going to cover. But the Chicago Teachers Union is a joke, all right? And the roundabout way of getting here, okay, was what on earth is the purpose of the Department of Education? On a state level, it is to make sure that the kids in the state can read and write. You know, and on the city level, of course, that's what it is. And on the nation's level, same thing, right? But these teachers' unions, they are only concerned with the rights and privileges of the teachers, not in what's going on with the students. How can I prove this? Well, Chicago, the teachers' unions, they want a raise, right? And they're willing to dump $830 million of debt onto the city in order to pay the teachers what they want because they're going on strike or whatever, right? And Brandon Johnson, who is the mayor of Chicago, was one of these teachers and is part of the teachers union. So you would think that negotiating against yourself, which is if you were to do that, and let's say Elon Musk is doing that, if Elon Musk is negotiating his own business dealings while he's working alongside in the government, that would be problematic. But for some reason, when Brandon Johnson is doing it in Chicago, it's not that big a deal. Everybody knows as soon as he leaves office, he's going back to being a teacher. And he's going to negotiate a large giveaway to the teachers unions. Well, that's problematic. Can't have that discussion, though. Again, narrative, not truth. That's what they're teaching here. But here's the biggest issue. From Illinois policy, a third, that's 30%, of 8th graders in Chicago can read at 8th grade reading level. That means you have 70% of the children in Chicago cannot read at grade level. 70% cannot read at grade level. What are they doing? Is that what you want? Do you actually give raises to people who are doing worse than ever before? Hey, you show up late, you botched every assignment that I give you, I'm going to give you more money because you clearly deserve it. What? Because that's what giving money to teachers unions is all about. You give money to people who succeed, not to money to people who fail. These people are failing and you can't get rid of them. But it's not just that, because reading is the very basics of it. Math is even worse when it comes to Chicago students. 20% of 8th graders can do math at their appropriate grade level. And for 11th graders, this means people who are 1 year away from graduation, only 25% could read and do math at their appropriate grade level. They're about to graduate. There's some 17-year-olds running around now in Chicago that can't read and do math at their appropriate grade level. But these are the people who want money. They want more money. What is the purpose of these unions? What is the purpose of the Department of Education? If their job is to not educate, then, because that's not what they're doing. They're not doing it. So what is their purpose? If the purpose is to give money to the Democrat Party, which is what they do, if I looked up how much money the teachers unions have given to the Democratic Party, then you will understand that it's all just a money laundering scheme. They're going to borrow money from probably some private investor, put all the money onto the taxpayers. I'm talking about Chicago. Put all the debt on the taxpayers. They're going to raise your taxes to pay for it. And then they're going to give that money to the teachers unions. And then the teachers unions are going to in turn give that money to the Democratic Party. Because we're not stupid here, right? This is what they do. This is what Elon Musk is finding out about. Sometimes it's more direct, but a lot of times it's the long form giveaways. And look, it might not be every penny. They might actually borrow $830 million for infrastructure, quote unquote, and they build a road or something in Chicago. But for the most part, that money is going to get diverted to other programs that are going to end up diverted to the Democrats. Because that's how they do it. That's why they care so much. So when I see CM Punk walking around in that shirt, I say he's either ignorant, because either A, he doesn't understand that the teacher unions are failures, because the kids can't fucking read and they can't count. So you as a teacher have failed if your kids cannot read and you cannot count. But then also you think about, not only are they ineffective, but they're also corrupt. That they're going to dump tons of money of debt onto the taxpayer so they can then turn around and spend money on the Democratic Party. Hopefully, or maybe, getting a new mayor put in position or keeping Brandon Johnson there for longer. But you're not allowed to have these conversations. This is how corruption works. It's all money laundering. If you were actually paying people to do a job and they're not doing it, you don't pay them. It's that simple. You don't give people a raise for not being good at their jobs. But that depends on what their job is. Brandon Johnson's job is not to make sure kids in Chicago can read. His job is to go out and negotiate contracts that benefit the teachers unions so they can turn around and give money to the Democrats. That's what his job is. And that's what all of this shit is about, right? So Dave Zirin could talk all this trash about Linda McMahon and how WWE is racist and all this kind of stuff. The bottom line is Dave Zirin is a Democratic ally. He might even be further left than most Democrats. You think he appears on like Democracy Now!, which is basically a fucking communist show, right? These guys are all about that corruption swing. And they'll of course complain if it was Republicans, but it's Democrats, so they're not going to complain. It's nonsense. And it fucks the taxpayer, who now are going to be, if this was to get passed, because it hasn't been passed yet. But if they were to do this, the taxpayer will be responsible for paying back a loan what was just a giveaway to the Democrats. And the taxpayer is going to be responsible for it. But that's you being able to follow the money. But they want to obfuscate with all this stuff about our heroic teachers and, do they care about our students? And they're going to destroy the education of blah, blah, blah. No. Ultimately, you just want the money. Even if it's just $100,000 that ended up being given to the Democratic Party and they can throw it behind a candidate in a couple of years or whatever. If you add that money to all the other money that they're siphoning off of, like construction workers and other unions and stuff like this, it's hundreds of millions of dollars. Hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's what it's really about. It's not about DEI programs. It's not about teaching, slavery or Harriet Tubman or anything like that. They don't care about none of that stuff. All of it is about, we want to use these programs to get funding to people that we want to fund. We want to give money and have control over local elections. That's what the Department of Education on the federal level is all about. We're going to take this money, divert it to certain people who are then going to divert it to our preferred candidates. At the end of the day, that's all it is. Saying you're going to turn that off is causing widespread panic. Just like when Elon Musk targeted U.S. aid, and following it has caused widespread panic. It's the exact same thing. It's a funding source because nobody actually learns anything in the Department of Education. All they do is fund. And when you figure that part out, the rest makes sense. So Dave Zirin is a bum. CM Punk is a bum. All these people are liars. This is all bullshit. Just recognize you are better off if you actually care about the education of children, of mentoring children yourself, or helping kids get into private schools who actually focus on their educational development. These Department of Education is bullshit. Whether it's local, national, whatever, it's bullshit. They don't care about your kids. They already have a tainted view of the world. Nobody is going to teach for free. Almost nobody teaches for free. Right? So it's all about pensions and paychecks and all this other stuff with these teachers unions. That's their job. Their job is not to make sure the kids can read. Their job is to advocate for the teachers. And everybody who's on the side of the teachers unions advocate for the teachers. You don't hear anything about students. Nothing about these students. Nothing about these kids can actually read at grade level, do math at grade level. They're failing. And what are these people going to be in 15 years? You think about these 11th graders who can't read or do math at grade level. In 15 years, where are they going to be? Some of them are going to kill each other because it's Chicago. They're surprised they're still alive at this point. There's probably any young people in Chicago at this point with the amount of murders they have. But then, how are they going to be able to function in society? And this is why universities have to constantly retrain these students. I went through that. When I went to college, I was older than most people. And I saw a lot of young people, fresh out of high school, have to be essentially retrained in basic English and basic math over and over again. I've seen this. How many of these students are actually going to be able to be functional members of society? And you're teaching them that the teachers are heroic. The teachers care about them when they aren't sure whether these kids can even read or not. Anyway, enough's enough. I'll talk to you guys later, man. Peace.